The United States has reimposed sanctions on Iran, and an already dire economic situation there is likely to get worse in November when the oil industry is the target. How much are Iran's problems a product of the US walking away from the nuclear deal signed by Barack Obama but ditched by President Trump? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. Mr. Trump is warning everyone, the entire world, that they too will suffer if they do business with Iran. The question is, who's listening? And does Tehran have the allies to avoid deeper financial pain? Russia and China suggest that they can help. Also, what damage will this inflict on Iran's president, hitherto seen as something of a moderate?
US sanctions reimposed. A national currency in free fall. Protesters taking to the streets across the country. Can Iran negotiate its way through this troubled climate? Or is it heading towards a series of political and economic crises? When the US decided to lift sanctions as part of the 2015 nuclear deal, Iran looked to get its economy going. But now President Donald Trump has reimposed those sanctions.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing that the U.S. is out of the Iran deal because it was a ridiculous deal for the U.S. and it's a ridiculous deal for the world.
The country was already struggling. Since April, Iran's currency, the rial, has lost half of its value. Now the first phase of renewed sanctions have taken effect and targeted a range of sectors from planes to carpets and cars. Trading of Iranian gold and purchase of US dollars by the Iranian government are also prohibited. The second phase in November will target the oil industry, the country's lifeblood. Many native industries, including agriculture and rug weaving, it's feared will suffer, and up to 1 million people, it's been said, could lose their jobs. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani refuses to negotiate with America while there are sanctions, and has been summoned to Parliament to address concerns over the economic crisis. President Trump warned of severe consequences for those who continue to trade with Iran, causing European firms to pull out from the country. But China, the biggest buyer of Iranian oil, looks unlikely to heed the US demands.
中方将在不违反自身国际义务的前提下，继续同伊朗进行正常的、透明的务实合作。
China has imported 718,000 barrels of oil a day, more than a quarter of Iran's oil exports in the first 5 months of this year. Chinese President Xi Jinping also agreed on a wide-ranging 25-year plan to broaden relations with Iran. This included increasing bilateral trade tenfold to $600 billion in the next decade. But there's a chance China might limit its oil imports from Iran if the US agrees to restart the stalled trade negotiations. With no signs of America lifting sanctions in the near future, can Iran turn the obstacle into an opportunity by becoming more self-reliant? Or will the hit on oil exports tip the country into a full-blown crisis, which could be felt around the world?
Okay, let's get cracking. Joining us from Skype, I'm pleased to say, in New York, we have Camelia Entekhabifard, an Iranian-American author and journalist. Welcome to the program. At the round table, we have Saeed Kamali Dehghan, the Guardian's Iran correspondent. Darius Wainwright's with us from the University of Reading. He's researching Iran's relations with the US and UK, has an Iranian mother, and Mahan Abedin, analyst and writer of Iranian politics. Well, we're going to look into this from a lot of different angles, but Saeed, let me come to you first of all. 2015 to now, and prior to 2015, when the sanctions were on, have things improved since they were lifted? Therefore, can we quantify what effect the new ones are going to make?
When President Rouhani came to power, sanctions were still in place, but he managed to, bring the economy back, bring down the inflation, control the unemployment, even under sanctions. And when the 2015 nuclear deal was signed, of course, it helped him to stabilize the Iranian economy more. Now, of course, the situation is much bad. In the past few months, we've seen the plummeting value of Iranian national currency. It's
down 70%, I think, since May.
I mean, since April, it's at least half of its value.
Yeah.
But it's incredible sad times in Iran. It's a combination of issues ranging from environmental challenges to economic grievances, lack of political freedoms at home, is creating this immense sense of hopelessness in Iran that few people have seen.
So things did get better, first of all under Rouhani while sanctions were there, and then after the sanctions were lifted. So what effect are the new sanctions likely to have?
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that Iran is a country that's very much used to sanctions. There's been one form of sanctions or the other since 1980, particularly a vast range of unilateral US sanctions. So the country has already developed a lot of resilience in terms of dealing with sanctions regime. But look, there's no doubt that this is going to be quite painful, especially as Rouhani came in with a specific mandate to end the sanctions. And he got a lot of them lifted, partially at least, with the promise that they would be lifted in full in time. So the public got used to the idea. So the people were getting used to the idea of living without sanctions. And now you're going to have new sanctions, which the Trump administration says are going to be the toughest in history. So there is a big political problem there for Rouhani in terms of actually justifying to his base what's gone wrong. And that's quite apart from the actual economic impact of these sanctions.
What have you got? 60% of the population under the age of 30. An awful lot of them don't have jobs. Camelia, the unrest, the potential for unrest there if things get worse is quite considerable, would you suggest?
It is considerable because I'm assuming given the lifting the sanctions in the past almost 3 years ago hasn't improved Iran's economy for a simple reason, because the investors need a secure political environment, and because of Iran's behavior in the region, in the lack of the trust, the European particularly and the big investor hasn't trusted this environment to come and invest in Iran. And that was one of the reasons even before Trump decided to pull out from the Iran nuclear deal, Iran economy has been collapsed. And I'm not saying the region, the people being ready for the new round of the sanction, and those rising demonstrations and all those protests are due to the coming up resilience from the people for the future sanctions and economical hardship.
So I suppose we're agreed at this table so far. Darius, I'm just going to bring you in, but we're agreed at this table so far that a difficult economic situation is probably going to be made worse. Now, what effect do you think Trump's declaration that nobody anywhere in the world should do business with Iran unless they want to suffer the consequences, what effect is that going to have on this? I mean, who's going to listen to him?
I think a lot of big businesses will be listening. I think they'll be listening very keenly to what he's been saying. And I think despite European and EU protestations that it's not going...
Because they still want, the European Union still wants to go with the joint plan of action.
Of course, the European Union still wants to carry on for commercial reasons, to ensure geopolitical stability in the region. But at the end of the day, who's the bigger fish?
Well, this is what I'm trying to get at. I mean, yes, okay, an awful lot of individual businesses may well say we're not going to do it, but if the European Union says, actually, you should carry on, if China says you should carry on, if Russia says you should carry on, where's the power of the US?
I think compared to the previous round of sanctions, under Obama, it's going to be it's not going to be as difficult because, I mean, at that time, Europe, even Russia and China were on the side of the US in terms of imposing sanctions, comprehensive sanctions. Whereas this time, it's the US alone. So it's not going to be as tough as those times. But, I mean, a lot of people are going to carry on doing business with Iran. And I disagree with Camelia in terms of Iran's economy collapsing. Iran's economy is not collapsing. We have to be careful. Of course, people are facing almost unprecedented, economic situations. The value of currency collapsing, but the plummeting value of currency is not indicative of how the economy is doing because, Iran actually has 17 billion surplus in its foreign currency. The reason
it's
not able to have it is because
what if it can't sell its
well, and
oil?
also, well, you see, this really totally negates the fact that the basic reality of the Iranian economy. It's very localized. If you go to the rural areas, it's a self-contained economy. People live in these basically self-enclosed worlds. They can feed themselves. There's plenty of agriculture. So this notion of the economy collapsing is hyperbolic at best, and also at a macro level, it completely ignores the fact that there's a lot of resilience inbuilt because of previous sanctions. The government, the private sector, the people in general, they're very ingenious at finding ways of getting around these sanctions and accommodating. And also on your point about not being able to sell oil, well, this is the big issue right now.
That's
the Trump
November.
And Iran has said they will close the Strait of Hormuz, etc. Firstly, I don't think the Americans can completely do
We
that.
should point out that the Straits of Hormuz is between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, and
Indeed.
through there, I think it's 75.
30% of the world's oil.
30.
30%.
Oh, I thought it was more than that, but
It
it's
passes
a
through
vast
there.
amount.
Yeah, and the Iranians have said, well, if we can't sell our oil, then we'll close off the strait in order to deny that opportunity to other countries. I mean, we're all hoping it doesn't come to that, simply because the Americans are not able to do that. Iran will continue to sell oil, albeit at lower levels. And even if it's at lower levels, the economy will still be, it will still keep carrying on, but there will be pain. Just one more point, we have to make a distinction here also about the effect of the sanctions and economic mismanagement in Iran.
Can we come on to that in a minute? Can we come on to
yes,
that? Camelia, I know you want to say something, but I'm going to give Darius a chance before I come back to you.
What we're talking about here, there isn't actually been that much change in policy towards Iran. This is just a repeat of stuff that's happened before. This isn't nothing new or
Well, the
overly
warning to
dramatic.
other people that if you do business with Iran is much more severe.
In terms of style, yes, but in terms of substance, this isn't anything new, really. The US taking a tough approach to Iran has been something that various presidential administrations have tried to do since 1979 to mixed to middling success. But this isn't something that's dramatically new.
Camelia, they disagree with you. I'm sure you're going to disagree with a couple of things that they said. But my question to you is about stability within Iran. The liberals, if you like, and the young people are going to say, hang on, if things get worse, we don't like what you're doing. This is to President Rouhani. The hardliners who didn't like the deal with the United States in the first place are going to say, well, look, this isn't working. You aren't working, if you like. So what danger is there to the current political setup in Iran and to Rouhani in particular, in your opinion?
Sure, I guess people are the best measure to say if the economy is good or bad, as we were hearing so much difficulty people facing in daily basis in Iran, and not just in the big cities. Other dear friends says the small cities know how they can overcome the sanctions, but the small cities also suffer from environmental mismanagement. We heard yesterday in Baluchistan of Iran, so many people has left the city and small villages because of those dust rising and lack of the clean sanitary water. All of them not comes from the sanction, it comes from the mismanagement and the corruption, which it added up to the sanctions too.
Therefore, is he in danger?
To answer your question, people elected President Rouhani for first time and the second time because of his promises improving the economy and also can make Iran nuclear deal. Why people needed the nuclear deal? For the simple reason the economy wasn't great, and the economy has been suffering even since the sanctions has been removed from the major, like the banking industries and the oil industries. Iran's wealth has been spent in the regional conflict, and people were clearly complaining about that. And those protests from the January, it haven't had anything to do with Trump. We never ever heard any chanting or slogans against the United States or against the Trump.
Okay, so on that point, what Camelia is suggesting is that he's already in a pretty precarious position. This might make things worse.
I mean, the fact that Iran is seeing these weeks of protests, I mean, it is a fact. It's, as I said, it's dire situation in Iran. But I mean, the reason Rouhani fulfilled on his main promise of securing this nuclear deal, the reason the economic benefits didn't come was because of the U.S. pressure. So it's not his fault that
he sold the idea of a nuclear deal to the people. They said, thank you very much indeed. Now there is no nuclear deal involving the United States.
And the reason for that is that the U.S. is violating, the terms of the agreement. It's not because Iran, as you know, that 11 times the IAEA...
Your ordinary citizen is not necessarily going to understand that.
They will not understand that. But
and the hardliners might use it against him.
What will happen, I think that's the sad point, is that what will happen as a result is not an idea of a regime collapse or anything like that the U.S. desperately wants. What is going to happen is that it's going to strengthen hardliners in Iran. So sadly, I think we're going to see more moderates like Rouhani or reformists being sidelined in the Iranian society, and hardliners who have, as Camelia said, control over Iran's regional behavior, even being more strengthened in the politics.
I wouldn't necessarily describe Rouhani as a reformist, but that's beside the point. Look, there's no
By comparison, he was.
Well, he's a centrist, and he's a creature of the national security establishment there, and that's why right now...
Something of a moderate was the way I described it.
He has now shifted toward the right, by the way, because he sees where the political winds are sailing from. But look, beyond the sanctions, Rouhani's economic team is very incompetent, and they're out of touch. The salaries they were giving to their ministers and their astronomical salaries, this was before the sanctions kicked in. Also, they've proven themselves to be uniquely unable to deal with the turbulence right now, the turbulence in the currency markets, in the gold markets. They could have stabilized it quite easily, but they failed to do it. The parliament has no confidence in that government in terms of its economic mismanagement, nor do the populace. So at the economic level, Rouhani has failed. And I don't think we can just blame the sanctions for that.
Okay, so let's talk about geopolitics in this one. Bring up your point, by all means, if you may. But a weakened Iran, a weakened Iranian president, a United States determined to impose its will on that region, it strengthens the United States' #1 seen ally, which happens to also be a major oil exporter, Saudi Arabia, which is a bitter enemy of Iran. The geopolitics of this, what do you make of that?
In terms of...
The United States with Saudi Arabia against Iran.
I think that it's something that will obviously go down quite well with Saudi Arabia, the tougher stance on Iran. I think it'll also go down quite well with Israel as well. In terms of whether it will ensure geopolitical stability, no, I don't think so.
No, it's going to increase it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I would have thought. And is that part of the plan?
I think so, yeah. I think the ultimate goal is regime change. I think it's quite a fanciful aim, but I do think that is what the goal is.
So economic fragility translates into instability within a country, and between countries it can lead to conflict. We've seen in the Iran-Iraq war in the past and the number of lives that cost. So we're going to see Iran involved in conflict at any particular time.
Iran and Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, are already involved in a number of conflicts that are in
proxy
the region.
Conflicts, like
conflicts. Yemen. Like Syria, like Yemen, like Iraq. To an extent, I think Iran's role in Yemen is exaggerated. But of course, Iran has a big role in Syria, a negative role, in my opinion, as well. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia is also involved in a negative role as well. And you see this double standards in the West and the hypocrisy when it comes to Saudi Arabia. Just last week you had this huge attack on a bus carrying children in Yemen, for example, where the UK was muted, the US was muted, no response whatsoever about the Saudi-led coalition airstrike in Yemen. But when it comes to Iran, there's a huge uproar about Iranian involvement.
So let's move on, if we may, to the allies that Iran has in this. China and Russia being perhaps the two most powerful. I'll come to you, Camelia, first on this, and then we'll kick it around the table. How much are they going to be able to, A, help Iran get out of what is an economic and perhaps a political hole, and secondly, sideline the United States?
Russia and China both have different interests in Iran, which I believe these sanctions are so beneficial for them for a certain reason. United States and Russia are not in a good terms and relations. Those punishment and sanctions on Russia is helping Russia to make the case to become closer to Iran, and has more interest by the imposed sanctions. So, for example, buying Iran's oil cheap to resell it again in the market, or also sending its goods to Iran as a trade to be not paying the the amount for the oils back to Iran. So for the China, the same thing. So that two countries cannot be counted because both are penalized by the United States. But if you want to talk about the Europeans, which Iran has more interest and is so much kicking to stay committed, to make them committed to the Iran nuclear deal, that it can be interesting to watch that out to see if the European likes to remain committed to what it has been guaranteed to Iran in post-nuclear deal, which in my opinion, they would be struggling to can fulfill those promises to Iran for a certain reason. They're afraid Iran also pull out from the nuclear deal, and the nuclear arm races become another headache in the region in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia clearly said if Iran want to obtain the nuclear arm, the Saudi wouldn't hesitate to have also. And also the refugee crisis, you just pointed about the confrontation, it can be happening in the region. I said no, but we never know if Israel and the US, what it has for the plan B against Iran, if Iran wants to restart its enrichment program. By then we would have another refugee crisis, and the Europeans definitely want to avoid, and they do their best to keep Iran committed to the deal. And even if to have to cover some of the penalties to the European companies, they would encouraging them to stay in Iran, whatsoever the prices will be for them.
Camelia, thank you very much indeed. I saw you nodding, Darius. What did you want to say in response?
I don't necessarily think that they will have much of an impact in terms of Iran's allies on the actual sanctions.
So the fact that it's just signed a new deal with Russia and other countries that border the Caspian Sea, the fact that China has said it's going to continue taking it takes an awful lot of energy from Iran. You don't think that's going to make any difference?
No, I don't think so at all.
I actually agree with Darius here, and I think, you see, Trump pulled out of the deal for two reasons, essentially. He wants curbs on Iran's ballistic missiles program, and he also wants...
Rather than just the nuclear program.
And also he wants to change Iran's regional behavior. Both Russia, China, and even the Europeans are marginal to that. They're not going to have a decisive impact. And also, but the crucial point is, the Iranians, I believe, are not going to budge on that. Iran is not going to give up its ballistic missile program, because that is its central deterrent force in terms of its national security doctrine. True. Iran has weak conventional military forces. It needs ballistic missiles to ensure a degree of deterrence. And also in terms of Iran's regional posture, that's a hugely complicated thing, because it feeds into how Saudi behaves, how the Israelis behave. If their behavior doesn't change, why should Iran change its behavior? So the Trump administration is not going to be able to meet those objectives, which then begs the question, where do we go from here?
This is what I was going to say. We're at an impasse, aren't we?
It is. I mean, what we can avoid is another conflict, and Trump is doing the opposite of bringing about a situation where we might see another conflict in the region. I mean, the Syria, of course, is still going in Assad's favor. The Yemen is stalemated. The conflict in Yemen. There is no, I mean, the UN special envoy was saying that after 2 years he's trying to get another talks on Yemen with no prospect of a resolution.
Do you agree with the fact that Iran's not going to say, yeah, you can limit our ballistic missiles program?
I agree with
Trump's not going to give any ground on that.
I agree with Mahan that it's not, I mean, the problem with the Middle East, sometimes Saudi Arabia or the US try to portray as it's Iran's problem. It's not only Iran is not the main problem in the Middle East. There's different factors. It's not a problem that Iran created. I mean, it's the vacuum after the US invasion of Iraq was created a change of order. And Iran,
I suppose we've done thousands of programs on that, and I appreciate the point you're making, but we are specifically talking Iran.
No, I mean, this is why
the ripples. It's always said when I've reported from the Middle East, one small, or seemingly small action will create ripples which affect the entire region.
But on ballistic missiles, Iran already has a self-imposed limit of 2,000 kilometers, which the Europeans and some Americans had already accepted. And Iran has made it quite clear, at least, they're not going to extend their missiles beyond that 2,000-kilometer range. Now, if the Americans...
Pretty much reach most places that you want to reach.
But you see, Iran is not going to unlearn that ability now, and they're not going to give up the missiles which they produce. That's just totally irrational.
If there is an impasse between the United States, if there's an economic war, what do you think the end or the result of that's going to be?
I think it will have more an effect on the region as a whole than on Iran as a country. I think we'll see an acceleration in the proxy wars. They may expand and get slightly bigger. In terms of what will actually happen to Iran and to regime change or whatever the US's aims are not going to be.
I
think internally,
is it? It's not leaning towards stability.
I think internally, it's getting worse and worse, and I think in the worst case scenario, I don't think we're going to see a regime change. I think people are wary of what's happening in Syria and other places, but we might see a military government. You know, the Revolutionary Guards and Harlan is taking over, and that's a very bad news for.
But that's
inside
very
Iran.
Unlikely, looking at the country's political culture.
But
we haven't had
wrap it up very quickly, guys, because we're coming towards the end. We've got about 40 seconds. So you say IRGC.
Well, I say in the worst case scenario,
not at all. But you see, I actually think that the Iranian strategy here is just to wait Trump out. They're waiting for the next U.S. administration, and they're just going to manage the situation on that basis.
We don't know whether that's going to be
but
6 years or 2 years, do we?
That's true.
Thank you very much from New York. I know you got up very early for us and appreciate that. Thank you to you three around the table. We are talking about what's just happened. It will be very interesting to see what happens come November. I think the date is November the 4th for the imposition of sanctions on Iran's oil industry. The prediction is that that's going to have a much more serious effect than what we're seeing at the moment. And that, for the region, if not America, cannot be good news. From me, David Foster, from all of my guests, thank you very much for joining us. We hope to have your company next time for Roundtable. Goodbye.